So I see that you started out with the Kansas City Chiefs in '63. How did
Yes, I
that come
did.
about? How did that come about?
Oh, they had a guy back then. I think it was Don Klosterman or somebody working for the Chiefs, and he knew how much I was involved in football or liked football and played in college and high school and all that. And he wanted to know if I would be interested in scouting for him on the West Coast, the 13 states in the West or something like that. I said, sure, I'd love it. So I started that way. And then they expanded my area, and then later they asked me to go to all around the country and just looking at the top prospects everywhere in all the areas. So it was just something I was really excited about, so it was kind of a natural thing for me.
Was it hard scouting back in that time with the AFL because the NFL was basically the dominant league and you were competing against them and you were thought of as like an afterthought?
Well, it was in a way, but it was kind of fun. I mean, we did things that they don't do now. You know, the two leagues were competing against each other. I mean, we were hiding players out where the NFL couldn't find them. They were hiding players out where we couldn't find them. And if you couldn't find the player and see him personally, you wouldn't draft him. So there were a lot of things going on like that that don't go on anymore. But it was a lot of fun. And looking back on it, it was a real exciting time in the league.
What was it like working for Lamar Hunt?
Great. Lamar was one of the nicest people I've ever known. It was a wonderful place to work.
When you won your first championship with the Chiefs, how gratifying was that, knowing that you brought some of those players in?
It was. I don't know how to describe it, but it was terrific. The two players that come to mind were Curly Culp and Mike Garrett. And Jan Stenerud, those are the three that come to mind right away. But it was great because it was always the little brother league or whatever it was, and something that wasn't at the level of the NFL. But to be able to go up against the NFL and do well, that was a big step for that league.
Then you went to the Falcons for 4 years. How was that different than the Chiefs?
I really can't tell you. It was when I went down to the Falcons. I think it was Tom Bratz was down there, brought me down there, and it was he and I were friends, and it was really a good thing for me just to see how different organizations did things, and I brought some things from the Chiefs that they wanted to know about, and they were interested about organization, and I learned things from them. So it was fun. I was lucky. I got through life. I always tell my wife now, I got through life without a real job of something that I love to do every day.
When you joined the Dolphins again, they were basically just had some terrible seasons coming in, and then they hired Don Shula as their coach away from the Colts, and they bring in some great players. What was it like working for the Dolphins?
Oh, it was great. I mean, working for Shula, I probably learned more working for Shula than anybody. Working for Don was great. He just he said, "Okay, you're down here to get us players." He turned it over to me to do that, and let me hire a scouting staff. And I was never second guessed or anything. He just he was the best. I tell you, the guy was just great. I really enjoyed my time. I learned so much under Don Shula that it really set me up for how to do things the rest of my career.
What made Shula so great?
Well, he knew every aspect of the organization. I mean, it to do with football. I mean, he could coach any position on the football team, offensively or defensively. He just he was a very demanding guy with the players, but they all responded to the way he did it. He was just one of those guys that could get the best out of anybody. I mean, when I look at some of the guys we had when we had the perfect season, when we won Super Bowls, I don't know if there's any other coach that could have done that with that group of players. I mean, they were good, but when I look at some of the later teams, I think maybe they weren't as good as these guys, man for man, but as a team, they were as good as anybody had ever played.
He believed in a strong offensive line. He brought Monty Clark in as a coach, and with the Larry
Right.
Littles, Jim Langers, Kuchenbergs, I think he understood that without a strong line, you weren't going to win on offense.
Oh, yeah, we had a great offensive line. I mean, those guys would have been great today. I mean, and Monty was a great offensive line coach. But when you look at Langer and Kuchenberg and all those guys, they were terrific.
How was Don Shula different than Hank Stram as a coach?
Well, Don was more there with you all the time, in your face and all that. Hank was around all the time, but not as close to everybody, at least in my position, that Don was. Don even put me in charge of on game days. He said, if you're not going to sit up in the stands and watch the game, you're going to do something. So he had me working with special teams and make sure every special team player was ready to go in when we had the punt team, a kickoff team, extra point team, all that stuff. So you had to be there. And one of the worst things that ever happened is we had one player that he said, no matter what, you always make sure you have his jersey in your hand when we call that special team, because he'll forget. And one time I sent the team on the field, and I didn't even notice it, and there were only 10 men on the field. And Shula yelled, and he knew exactly who wasn't on the field. And he came over and grabbed me, and I thought, oh my God, I never made the mistake again. But you had to hold that particular player's jersey every time he was on a special team to make sure he didn't forget to go on the field.
With the Dolphins, I mean, you had some great players with Paul Warfield on offense and Larry Zonk and those guys. When the WFL came on, how hard was that on you when you lost Warfield and Zonk to that league?
Oh, it was tough. I just couldn't believe that league would really make it. And thinking of some of those players to go over there and the money they were throwing around. But there's something, I just didn't think that team would make it. I mean, that league would make it. And of course, it really didn't. But it was tough to lose those guys. But Shula is one of the amazing people. Anything that happened that was bad, he didn't even want to address it or talk about it. It was like nothing happened. We're just going to go on. We're going to be better now than we ever were. And he could get his point across where everybody felt, it's not a big deal. We're going to be fine. We have other guys that can do as well. And son of a gun, we would. He was just an amazing guy that anything bad that happened, you never dwelled on it. It was look at the good side of things and we'll be better.
So you go to the Dolphins in 72 and you get a perfect season your first year there. What was that season like?
Oh my gosh, it got harder and harder as it got toward the end of the season, because every team that the Dolphins played had more incentive to win that game than anything, because we hadn't lost a game. But there was also a lot more pressure on our team. But it was just amazing how that team could go through and do it. Something probably I don't think it'll ever be done again.
Why don't you think that any other team can do it?
Because I just don't. I watch the NFL every year and watch it closely and look at all the teams and everything. I just don't think it's possible today. I mean, it's possible, but I just don't think it's likely.
I think what was amazing with Shula was he won with three different Hall of Fame quarterbacks with three different styles. Unitas with
Yep.
Baltimore, Greasy with the Dolphins, and then Marino. I mean, he goes from Unitas a passer, Greasy more handing off, and then Marino again a passer.
Well, the most amazing thing during all that, to me, was when Greasy went down, that we won with Earl Morrill. Now, I really think Earl's a great person. I like Earl and a good quarterback. But Earl wasn't what Greasy was, nor a Marino or anything like that. But when we had Earl in there, if you'd been around him, a great guy, but he wasn't the quarterback that you thought would take you to the Super Bowl. But Shula did things a little different with Earl than he would with Greasy, and sure enough, we pulled it off, and it was just amazing. So I think what the things that Don did in cases where something like that happened, a Greasy injury, I thought he was just amazing.
What made you
I don't
decide?
know many coaches could do that. What made me decide what?
What made you decide to join the Washington Redskins as GM?
It was more responsibility, and it was just a step up, I thought. And I talked to Don about it, Shula about it, and he said, it's a great opportunity. And it was. Maybe he was trying to get rid of me. I don't know. But it was one of those things. He encouraged me to go. I didn't want to go. I said, I don't want to leave here. I've grown up near the beach all my life. And he said, no, you ought to go up for the interview. Go up and meet him and see what it's like. And so I did. I went up there, and when I met with Ed Bennett Williams, the guy was such a nice guy. I decided then after the interview, he had offered me the job, and I went back to Don and said, you know what, I'm going to take the job. And said it's going to be different, but it'll be fun. And so I did that. And then when we went up there, I went into a situation where their philosophy was completely different from mine. I wanted to build through the draft and do all that. And at that time, when I was up there, the George Allen era was keeping all the old veterans and always trade for old veterans and forget about the draft. So we didn't have any draft choices when I went up there, really, because he'd traded them all away for veterans. So I had a whole different philosophy, built through the draft, not by that way. And so I've got old letters here, hate mail for getting rid of some of the old veterans that had won for George, but they were old guys. They weren't required to do the work that you have to do in football today. But he had his way of winning, and we just had a different philosophy. So it was different. So there was a lot of pressure on us in Washington because of getting rid of all the old guys. All the old guys, oh my gosh, they hated me for getting rid of those guys. They wanted lifetime jobs and getting all that money, and even though they were, they weren't at that level anymore to play in the NFL and win. But when we go back to Redskin reunions every year, I still see a lot of those guys. We always go out with Sonny and Kilmer and a lot of those guys and have a lot of fun and talk about those days.
I think one of your best coups when you first joined them was you stole the Bears coach and Jack Pardee, who had taken the Bears to the playoffs for the first time in years. And he was a young coach, but he did pretty well his first couple of years with you. Yeah,
he did. Then we just decided to go a different direction.
You did something similar to what Shula did with the Dolphins again, with the Redskins build a strong offensive line with Russ Grimm, Jacoby, and all those guys. Did you kind of try to use Shula's blueprint?
Sure. Yeah, we did. But by that time, I pretty much had a plan in my head, what we had to do. But when you do that, you have to look at what the prospects are in the draft. Is it a strong year for offensive line? And it just happened to be that we did. Plus, you have to have the right coaches. I've been with teams where if you draft a guy in the 10th round, the coach has already got in his mind, no 10th rounder is going to make our team. We had a coach where didn't matter if we drafted him in the 10th or 11th round, or he wasn't even drafted, and we signed him as a free agent, undrafted kid. Our coaches, our agreement was you give them the same opportunity as give a first rounder. And if you do that, we had a lot of kids that weren't drafted or were drafted late in the round, make it and do well. One of the best example I can think of is when we took Darryl Greene in the 10th round or 11th round, whatever Darryl was, or the last pick in the first, whatever it was, last pick in the first round. And I called Darryl to tell him, and he said, Bobby, because I'd been down there to scout him, he said, why'd you wait so long to take me? And I said, well, that's where we had our pick because we won the Super Bowl. We didn't have a pick that early in the round. So he took you. And so I said, don't blame me. Look at all the other teams that passed you up. And then Darryl came in, and Richie Pettibone, our secondary coach, said, Bobby, a guy that small can't play in this league. And I said, well, this guy's different. And Darryl played, what he played, 18 years or something?
Yeah, I mean, he had his speed till the end, worked out constantly, kept himself in great shape.
Right. Yeah, it was great.
So what made you decide to hire Joe Gibbs as coach?
Well, I had a good friend, Ernie Zampese. And Ernie and I kept in touch a lot. And Ernie had coached with Joe a long time. And so I called Ernie. Ernie and I used to talk a lot. And I called Ernie and I said, what do you think? Is Joe ready? And he said he's ready. Because we'd talked about Joe before, and Joe was coaching with Don Coryell, and I liked Coryell's style of football. And so Ernie said, Joe's ready now. So I called Joe and said, hey, will you take the job if I get to pick you? And he said, yeah. I said, okay, get your staff together and keep our defensive staff, but get your offensive staff. Start figuring out who you'd want on offense and keep our defensive staff. And so he said, okay. So Mr. Cook called me in when the time came and said, okay, what are we going to do? And I said, well, I've already got a guy. He said, what do you mean you got a guy? I said, I got a guy to be our coach. He said, who are you thinking of? I said, well, you don't know him. You haven't heard of him. This guy named Joe Gibbs. He said, Joe Gibbs? Who in the hell is Joe Gibbs? He said, they'll crucify me if I bring a guy in here named Joe Gibbs. Nobody ever knows who he is. And I said, I know they don't. That's the good thing about him. Everybody isn't after him. Well, it'll be fine. So he let me hire him. We put the staff together and kept the defensive staff. And then we went on to lose our first 3 games. And I would go out of town usually Tuesday mornings to go different colleges around the country scouting and look at the film, look at the game film Monday with the coaches, and go out Tuesday scouting and come back Friday night, wherever the team was. And Mr. Cook called me and said, I want you to get out to my house right away. And I said, no, I can't. I've got to go scouting. He said, do you own this team? I said, no, sir. He said, you cancel your plans and get out to my house now. And I had to drive all the way out to Middleburg or Upperville, wherever he lived. And he sit me down and said, I should fire you and the coach you hired. And so it was awful for the first 5 games. Then we started winning. And it was after a couple games we lose. He said, and you bring your coach out here with me. And I go into the offensive room and say, Joe, you got to go to Mr. Cook's. He said, I can't. We're game plan. And he said, Mr. Cook could say, do you own this team? And I said, no, sir. He said, you get your coach and bring him out here. He'd shoo us out, send us back home. Then we started winning. If anything, he'd say, he'd tell Joe, you're the coach I always wanted, Joe. You're the first thing I told Bobby, you get Joe Gibbs. That's the guy we wanted. Joe and I still to this day laugh about that.
How gratifying was it when you made the Super Bowl with the Redskins, your first one, and you're playing against the Dolphins and go and beat them?
Oh, it was great. It really was. I missed living down in Key Biscayne in Miami. I like that weather and the ocean and everything, but it was just great. Oh, I tell you.
That Super Bowl team, I mean, again, it was incredible. You had a cast-off at quarterback and Theismann, a cast-off and Riggins and running back, guys they thought were through, and you win a Super Bowl with them.
Yeah, well, Riggins had quit, and the funny thing is that when I used to go to all the colleges scouting, I had met John's sister, John Riggins' sister. She was a secretary at the University of Kansas at the coach's office. So I called her and said, "Hey, it's Bobby calling. You know what? I want to know if you can set it up if I come out there that I can talk to John and meet with John." And I had met John before, so I had a decent relationship with him. He trusted me and everything. So I flew out there and saw his sister, and then she set up the meeting so I could talk to John. So I met privately with John and said, "Hey, look, it's all different. It's not the George Allen thing anymore. It's Joe Gibbs. Just give it a try, and the best thing I can do, I'll have Joe come over here, and you meet him personally, and you'll trust him." So I had Joe come over. We all met with John. John agreed that he could play for Joe, and so that was the way we got John to come back to the Redskins.
That second Super Bowl victory against the Broncos, what was that like?
Well, every one of them's great. I can't remember which one's greater, but I guess the second one, I guess people expect you to win, but that was when Elway was playing, right?
Right.
Yeah, that was big. I mean, because I always thought the perfect quarterback was John Elway, and I thought, boy, to be able to play against those guys and do well would really be something, and that worked out.
What was amazing with Gibbs was something similar to Shula. He won Super Bowls with 3 different quarterbacks.
Yeah, he did. We had Don Strock had to come in, and no, he was amazing. I've never been around a coaches like Shula and Gibbs that could adapt to anything. Plus, the other thing about it wasn't when a player like that would go down, some coaches would go, "Oh no, now what do we do?" Shula wouldn't bat an eye. "Hey, we're going to be fine." We had Delgado came in and won games for us. Jim Delgado, the quarterback. But we had it was nothing. You'd not know it by his demeanor. Nothing bothered him. "We're going to go on. We're fine. All our backups are as good as our starters," and all that. So it was just amazing how he handled it. I've been with teams where somebody got hurt, and coaches would show it to the players. "Oh no, now what do we do?" And that affects the players, but it never affected Shula. I mean, Shula never let it show or affect the players.
Yeah, you go from Joe Theismann to Schrader, and then Doug Williams takes you to the Super Bowl win against the Broncos.
Right. Yeah, it was great.
Did you realize how momentous that was to have the first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl?
No, I didn't, because Doug and I got to be friends, and he's a great guy. It really never entered my mind. It was just watching him practice, and I knew how good he was, and I'd scouted at Grambling every year, and so I knew how many good players came out of there, and Coach Robinson had more good players. I mean, when we think of the players that came out of that league, no, it didn't never entered anybody's mind. Doug was part of the team. Okay, it's your shot. He went in, had a great game, had a great career.
Was that hit
the only heat I got was when I think I'm repeating myself now, is when we took Darryl Greene, and Richie Pettibone said guys that small can't play in the league. So, but it worked out.
Was there ever a hit as gruesome as that one Theismann took on Monday Night Football?
Oh no, I can't. I can see it every time somebody talks about it. I can see it. No, that was the worst. That's the first time I ever heard of anything like a compound fracture. Boy, it was amazing. And then who came in? Jay Schrader?
Jay Schrader.
Yeah, and then, now Jay was a physical talent, man. He had as much as anybody. He's just kind of a screwball. As far he wasn't the kind of guy that coaches like to coach, but he had talent, and they worked with him and put the stuff in that he could do best, and only the stuff he could do best, and made a smaller playbook for him. Not because of mental stuff, just they just felt that he had the experience yet, and he did a good job.
You guys really knew how to recruit players because there wasn't really free agency, but you got one of the first free agents in Wilbur Marshall. I remember Wilbur telling me that you guys flew him on Jack Kunkutz's private jet, wined and dined him, got him to sign with the Redskins, and then he said Walter Payton had just retired, calls Wilbur up. He had never talked to Wilbur and says, "You got to sign with the Bears." Wilbur goes, "I meet with Mike McCaskey," and what does he do? He has me in his office for ham and cheese sandwiches, trying to convince me to sign with the Bears. He goes, "I already had my mind made up. I was going to the Redskins."
Yeah, it was great. Oh, he was something. I tell you, he was an amazing guy.
So, how did you decide to leave the Redskins after having all that success?
Well, it was a chance that my mom and dad were getting old in California, and I missed them. And they used to come back for a game each year to the Redskins, but they were getting to the age then that they didn't want to travel or anything. And I thought I would like to be near them because we were real close, and they were getting way up there. And so that was the reason that I left. That was the only reason. So I made the agreement. Was it that the agreement to sit out a year? If I left, the owner said, "If you sit out a year, don't go to another team." Was that the one? I think so. I said, okay. So I sat out a year. Is that the year I did the NFL Network?
Yes.
Yeah. So I sat out a year and then got a call from those guys who did that NFL Network for a year, and then went to the Chargers.
You hire Bobby Ross and you get a Super Bowl in your third year there. Even though you didn't win it, I mean, you did something that no one had done in San Diego.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun, and we got that far, but that was fun. They were great memories.
How did you decide how did you know when it was time to retire?
Well, I thought the travel, going everywhere in the country looking for players, was starting to get to me, the travel, never being home much. And I thought, is this what I want to do the rest of my life? And I just thought the travel was good. And I didn't trust, I was bad. I didn't want to draft players I hadn't seen personally. So if I couldn't travel and see them, and all I could see them is on tape, I just thought it was time for me to do something else and retire. I was getting on flights, flying to, if there's a player from where we drafted a player, I think from Rhode Island, we drafted a player from, Upper Peninsula in Michigan, all those places. I would be traveling the whole time. And I had kids, and I wanted to see them play their Friday night games and all that stuff. So just a lot of things went into the decision. It was a pretty easy decision.
Now that you're a finalist for the Pro Football Hall of Fame, how does it make you feel?
Not any different. I did what I did, and if it worked, and things seem to work out okay. If I make it, great. If I don't, that's the way it goes. The worst thing about making it is you think I have to make a speech. But other than that, no, it's fine. I've been up there for several people's inductions, and it's a real honor. And it's not. But if I don't make it, I'm not going to hold it against anybody or be upset. It's just the way it goes. I had a fun time being able to go through life with this kind of job, and I'm content with that. So if I make it, great. If I don't, worst thing about making it is having to give a speech. But I'll have to do that if I make it.
Hopefully one of your linemen makes it along with you this year. And Joe Jacoby, he's been a finalist several times, and it's his last year of eligibility, and I think he deserves to be in.
Oh, definitely. Oh, my gosh. I can't believe every year it's happened. I can't believe that he's not in it.
Who was the one player that you think was your biggest find ever?
I always go back to Darryl Greene because his size and the remarks when we drafted him and all that and how long his career lasted. I always think, oh my gosh, here, if we hadn't drafted Darryl, our secondary coach would have been happy because we didn't have a guy that small. But we did draft him, and he was really happy because Darryl could take anybody we played, their best receiver, and say, okay, that's Darryl's, and the rest of the scheme would be for the rest of the other 10 defensive players. But no, I've never been around anybody like Darryl, so that was probably one of the most satisfying picks we ever had, to have him there at the end of the first round.
You mentioned Jay Schrader, all the talent he had. Another guy who had a ton of talent, it seemed like he kind of wasted it because of some of the issues he had, was Dexter Manley. What kind of a player was he?
Dexter is a heck of a player. Dexter was a fun guy to be around. He practiced like it was a game. It was tough for any offensive tackle to handle him in practice. He was just a screwball. I mean, he practiced hard every day. He gave the offensive lineman a real picture of what a game is like. But boy, I'll tell you, that guy was really something. I would have hated to have been an offensive tackle to have to play against Dexter every week.
What I never understood is when you left the Redskins, why they never gave Bobby Mitchell a chance to be the GM.
I don't know. Bobby and I were pretty close. A great guy, and he'd been around it all. I don't know. I guess the only thing I thought, maybe I spoiled somebody in this sense. Not that I was better than anybody, but most general managers stayed in the office and did that. I was one of the few general managers that went all around the country all football season looking for players. I don't know that Bobby wanted to do that, and I don't know many general managers wanted to do that. But I was afraid not to do it because I wanted to see the players in practice and do all the other stuff before we ever draft them. So that's why I made the deal that I'll be the general manager, but I still want to go out all season and look at players. I'd come back every weekend for the games.